The 2026 Formula One season has just started, and teams are already furious. George Russell just took pole position in Australia. Mercedes locked the entire front row. And the gap to the rest of the grid was shocking. Almost 0.8 of a second. In modern Formula One, that is not just fast. That is domination. But the real story started after qualifying. Because when rival engineers began analyzing the speed traces and hybrid deployment data, they noticed something unusual in the Mercedes power delivery. A pattern that looked different from every other car on the grid. More consistent acceleration, longer electrical deployment, and power that seemed to keep building even at the end of the straights. Now several teams believe they may have found evidence of a potential Mercedes power trick, and they want the FIA to investigate it immediately. Because if what they are seeing in the data is real, it could explain why the silver arrows suddenly look unstoppable at the start of the 2026 season. And it could become the first major technical controversy of the entire championship. The tension actually started building long before Russell crossed the line for pole position. During the practice sessions on Friday, engineers across the paddock were already paying very close attention to the timing screens. Not because Mercedes was slightly faster, but because the numbers looked unusually strong. Every time teams simulated long runs, one car consistently appeared at the top of the data. The Mercedes. George Russell's race pace simulations were immediately flagged by several rival engineers. Some internal comparisons suggested his average lap time during long runs was nearly half a second faster than the closest competitors. In Formula One terms, that kind of gap is enormous. Normally, teams expect differences of 1 or 2 tenths during practice. Anything larger usually means different fuel loads or different tire strategies. So at first, most teams assumed Mercedes might simply be running a lighter fuel program. But when qualifying began, that explanation quickly disappeared. Because the same performance advantage appeared again. Russell looked comfortable from the moment the session started. The car remained stable through fast corners. The rear axle stayed calm under braking. And when the Mercedes exited slow corners, something very interesting happened. The acceleration looked stronger than the rest of the grid. At first, the difference seemed small. Just a few extra kilometers per hour halfway down the straight. But when engineers began overlaying the GPS traces from Russell's lap with data from other cars, a pattern started to appear. The Mercedes did not just accelerate quickly. It continued accelerating longer than the others. Normally, hybrid deployment in Formula One fades slightly toward the end of long straights. The electrical energy stored in the battery begins to run out. The car still accelerates, but the boost becomes weaker. But the Mercedes traces suggested something different. The electrical deployment looked extremely consistent. The power seemed to stay strong almost all the way to the braking zone. And that kind of behavior immediately raises questions inside rival garages. Because the new 2026 regulations place enormous importance on hybrid efficiency. The power unit now depends heavily on electrical deployment. Drivers receive bursts of electric power when exiting corners. That power comes from energy harvested during braking earlier in the lap. If a team can harvest more energy than its rivals, it can deploy more power later. But harvesting energy is limited by physics. There are only a few heavy braking zones around Albert Park, which means the total energy available during a lap should be relatively similar for every team. And yet the Mercedes appeared to have more electrical power available. That observation quickly became one of the main discussion points inside Ferrari and Red Bull. Engineers began analyzing every detail. Speed traps, throttle traces, energy deployment patterns. They wanted to understand how Mercedes was producing that acceleration advantage. Because if the difference comes from the power unit, it could change the competitive balance of the entire season. Charles Leclerc even admitted after qualifying that Mercedes looked extremely strong and clearly ahead of the field right now. Red Bull engineers reached a similar conclusion. From their perspective, the Mercedes package looked like the most complete car in Melbourne. Strong in long runs, fast in qualifying, and extremely efficient with its hybrid systems. But the biggest concern was still the gap. Nearly 0.8 of a second between Russell's pole lap and the closest non-Mercedes car. In the modern era of Formula One, that kind of margin is extraordinary. Which is exactly why teams have started asking the FIA to take a closer look at the data. Not because they are certain something illegal is happening, but because when a performance advantage appears this large, every detail must be understood. And the most intriguing detail from Australia is still the same one engineers noticed first. The way the Mercedes power unit seemed to deliver electrical energy differently from every other car on the grid. Which leads to the question now circulating quietly through the paddock. Did Mercedes simply build the most efficient hybrid system of the new era? Or did they discover a clever way to extract more performance from the regulations than anyone else expected? But the deeper engineers looked into the data from Melbourne, the more intriguing the situation became. Because it was not just the straight-line speed that looked unusual. It was how the Mercedes delivered that speed. When analysts compared the telemetry traces from different cars, they noticed something subtle but important. Most power units showed small fluctuations in acceleration during the lap. A burst of electrical energy when exiting a corner. Then a gradual drop as the battery depleted along the straight. That pattern is normal. It happens because the energy stored in the battery is limited. But the Mercedes traces look different. Instead of showing that gradual drop, the acceleration curve appeared far more consistent. Almost as if the electrical deployment lasted longer than expected. That detail alone would not necessarily prove anything unusual. After all, Mercedes has always been one of the most advanced manufacturers when it comes to hybrid technology. But when engineers began combining the acceleration data with the speed trap numbers, another interesting detail appeared. The Mercedes was not just quick in one place. It was quick everywhere. Strong acceleration out of slow corners. Competitive speed through the middle of the straights. And still gaining kilometers per hour right before the braking zones. That kind of consistency is extremely difficult to achieve with hybrid systems. Because energy management in Formula One is a delicate balancing act. Drivers must harvest energy during braking, store it in the battery, and then deploy it in very precise moments around the lap. If that process is not perfectly optimized, the battery drains too early. The driver runs out of electrical power before reaching the next braking zone, and the car loses valuable speed. Yet the Mercedes appeared to avoid that problem completely. Which is why rival engineers began asking a new question. What if Mercedes has found a more efficient way to harvest energy? Because if the system can recover even slightly more electrical power during braking, the advantage becomes enormous. More energy harvested means more energy available for deployment. And more deployment means stronger acceleration throughout the lap. That possibility would explain why Russell's pole lap looked so controlled. The car never appeared to struggle for power. The acceleration remained smooth. The hybrid system delivered energy exactly when the driver needed it. And that kind of performance naturally attracts attention inside the paddock. Especially when the margin is so large. Nearly 0.8 of a second separated Russell from the closest non-Mercedes car in qualifying. That is not a small advantage. That is domination. Which is why Ferrari and Red Bull engineers immediately began studying the telemetry from Melbourne in greater detail. Not because they are accusing Mercedes of breaking the rules, but because they want to understand exactly where the performance is coming from. In Formula One, that kind of investigation happens every season. Whenever a team finds a clever technical solution, rivals try to decode it as quickly as possible. Sometimes they discover a legal innovation. Sometimes they find a gray area in the regulations. And sometimes they simply realize that another team has executed the rules better. Right now, the Mercedes power unit appears to fall into that final category. The team seems to have mastered the balance between hybrid energy recovery and electrical deployment better than anyone else. And if that interpretation proves correct, the rest of the grid could face a difficult challenge. Because improving hybrid efficiency is not something that can be fixed overnight. It requires new software strategies, new energy management models, and sometimes even mechanical changes to the power unit itself. Which means that if Mercedes truly has discovered a breakthrough in hybrid performance, the advantage could last for several races. Maybe even longer. That possibility is exactly why the discussions around the Mercedes power unit are becoming louder inside the paddock. Teams want answers. They want clarity from the FIA. And most importantly, they want to know whether the performance we saw in Australia is simply the result of brilliant engineering, or the beginning of a new technical arms race in the 2026 Formula One season. And this is where the story inside the paddock becomes even more intense. Because after qualifying ended, the conversations between engineers did not stop. If anything, they became louder. When teams returned to their garages, the first thing many technical departments did was open the GPS overlays from Russell's pole lap. Every team in Formula One collects enormous amounts of comparative data during sessions. Speed traces, throttle inputs, corner entry speeds, acceleration curves. And when all those layers were placed on top of each other, something very interesting appeared. The Mercedes was not just faster in a single sector. It was faster in multiple phases of the lap. On corner exit, mid-straight, and even right before the braking zones. That pattern suggested something extremely efficient inside the power unit system. Because normally, hybrid deployment forces teams to choose where they want their electrical power. Some teams deploy aggressively at corner exit, Others save energy for the end of long straights. But the Mercedes looked like it had power everywhere, which is exactly what began raising eyebrows across the paddock. Several engineers began quietly discussing a possibility. What if Mercedes has found a way to harvest slightly more electrical energy during braking than their rivals? Even a small improvement in harvesting efficiency can create a massive performance advantage. More harvested energy means more electrical deployment later in the lap. More deployment means stronger acceleration. And stronger acceleration means lap time. That theory would explain the unusual consistency of the Mercedes speed traces. Instead of running out of electrical boost halfway down the straight, the car appeared to keep deploying power almost until the braking zone. For rival teams, that is exactly the kind of detail that triggers deeper analysis. Because Formula One regulations place strict limits on how much electrical power can be deployed. But the efficiency of how that energy is harvested and stored is where teams can innovate. And Mercedes has historically been one of the strongest teams in that area. Their hybrid systems dominated the early hybrid era years ago. Now, under the new 2026 regulations, it appears they may have taken another step forward. That possibility explains why the mood across the paddock has changed so quickly. Ferrari engineers are studying every data trace they can obtain. Red Bull is analyzing acceleration curves corner by corner. And even midfield teams are comparing their telemetry with what they saw from the Mercedes. Because if the Silver Arrows truly have discovered a more efficient hybrid strategy, the consequences could be enormous. Hybrid systems now represent a huge percentage of total power in Formula One, which means even a small advantage in energy management can translate into several tenths of a second per lap. Over a full race distance, that difference becomes devastating. It also explains why the Mercedes drivers looked so comfortable during qualifying. George Russell's pole lap was incredibly clean. No instability. No hesitation in acceleration.